have the department's report in front of us. You heard the presentations and the questions. And
Let's see.
and welcome. We do hear you, Chief Scott and Commander Hamilton. Welcome. And if
Thank you.
we did hear, as I think you did, the prior presentation, very impactful. You heard at least from the
Can you get the other one too?
desire to include that transcript of their presentations along with the report, and you also heard a desire amongst at least some of the commissioners to make a recommendation to City Council that the task forces be fully funded. I open this up to you now for your presentation because I do think we need to hear about the impact the cutbacks have had on the efforts of the human trafficking task forces. So with that, I turn it over to you.
I'll defer to Chief Scott, and I'll go second.
All right, well, first I have a Sergeant Yolanda Marcellus is with me, but for some reason, I don't think you guys can see her. She's off in the distance. But I will just start off with what the report says. And it basically really says that if we don't have the funding, we will have less task forces. As you can see, just in the year, we're 15% less arrests. We have 44% less decrease in rescues. Last year we had 266 pet stops, and then this year we're at 44. And last year we had 191 vehicle stops that addressed this issue, and this year we're at 22 stops. As you know, when we do these investigations and these rescues, it really takes a lot of resource and it takes a lot of time. And I think our speakers before that really discussed about having the education and the training that is required to do that. But I want to keep in mind that it's not just the rescue that we have to focus on, especially when you talk about the human trafficking and the prostitution that is in South Los Angeles. Primarily, our prostitution track is on Figueroa Boulevard. It's about 3.5 miles. It encompasses 2 police divisions. And since we've had the pandemic, we have seen a huge increase of activities in that track. And mostly you're seeing it because we're stopping girls and getting pimps that are from like San Diego. We're getting them from San Bernardino, from out of state, that are coming here to this track. We're noticing that we're seeing an uptick because the strip clubs and all the places that they would normally go are closed because of the pandemic. And what we are able to do is attack the problem in 3 folds. And I think they said that in the last project. We're able to provide education, and not just education to the girls, but education to our community and education to our police officers. We're able to do engagement, and we're also able to do enforcement. And our enforcement, it's in 2 folds. It's one, trying to rescue the girls, also try to break that chain of supply and demand, and removing the Johns off the street. Undercover use of force, identifying victims, making sure that we're apprehending the pimps. We do traffic enforcement in that area. We make sure, if you look at Figueroa goes across schools. We're fortunate this year that our schools are closed, but we are seeing, when we talk about our prostitution and we're talking our rescue and our human trafficking, that it's 24/7. It doesn't stop. So you need resources to be out there. At one point we had them trying to pick up and recruit women as they were going to church. So we made sure during the church time hours that we had footbeats and resources there. During school, we make sure that the children have safe passage as they're going through their schools. And without the funding of those things, you'll see a decrease in our presence. You'll see a decrease in our ability to do as many operations and fully take these cases through prosecution. And I'll just give you an example. Just like last week, just in South Bureau, I know there was 33 rescues, and in South Bureau, we had 3 of those rescues were here in South Bureau. one of the girls or the minors that we arrested, this would be her third rescue. And we're hoping that this will be a trick. So I'm gonna turn it over a little bit to my sergeant so she can talk a little bit about the investigation, hands-on, boots on the ground, and then we'll open it up for questions if you have any.
Good afternoon, Commissioners and Chief Moore. My name is Sergeant Yolanda Mancias. I am the supervisor for OSB's Human Trafficking Task Force. It's myself, Sergeant 1, and I have 7 investigators. My investigators operate as detective case carrying officers, investigators, as well as UC operators. So when we talk about the complexity of human trafficking, we're talking about the necessity of getting more victims for successful prosecution as required by our human trafficking DAs. A lot of times we don't get that cooperation on the first interview during the first contact. Like a lot of the survivors said, a lot of our citations and our arrests, it takes multiple contacts for them to actually build trust, to provide little bits of information at a time, and in which we document, and it actually is compiled. And when we do apprehend our traffickers, a lot of times our surveillance operations, we conducted more in 2020, but that's also incorporating, looking for those pimps and those traffickers who are frequently monitoring and surveilling their victims while they work. It takes hours of sitting, waiting, watching to make sure that we have the right person attached to our victim. So one of the things also that I wanted to talk about with regards to our investigators is that they're very, very well versed in vice activities as well as human trafficking. I've got 3 human trafficking experts on my unit, and their resilience matches that resilience of the victims. They're going out there, they've been doing it for quite some time, and they're compassionate. Many times I know we look at numbers and we look at arrests and decrease and increases, but a lot of times we are paying for food out of our pockets. It's heartbreaking to see a lot of these children, once they are in police custody and sitting down in a soft room, immediately fall asleep because they're so tired. And it'll take a toll on an officer because these human trafficking investigators are so into what they do. It's hard not to break that professional and that human side. Our overtime details have stopped, but those details actually allowed us to educate officers that assisted us that don't normally do human trafficking. We trained them, we educated them on what they were looking for, so they in turn on the regular duties could actually use some of that knowledge when they were working along Figueroa. Other than that, I really don't know if we've got Figueroa is its own monster. It's 3.5 miles from Gage all the way down to Imperial. We've got about 30 motels. We've just got an environment ripe for human trafficking. We've got girls from 60s to the 70s block, all the way Century and down south. We've got a lot of dark, areas and everything. We can actually go in and talk about the different things that contribute to human trafficking along Figueroa, but we are doing our best. We do focus a lot on our complex investigations because once those sentences are secured, these pimps have gotten an idea that pimping girls isn't gonna it's not a slap on the wrist. So we work closely with the DA's office to ensure that our investigations are thorough and that we are looking for a successful prosecution in the end.
Okay. Thank you, Sergeant. Thank you, Chief Scott. Have you concluded, Chief Scott? I just want to be sure.
No, just again, I'd like to make sure that our report is reviewed and then transmitted to public safety, and that it will have an impact. But again, as Chief Moore would say, that doesn't stop our enforcement, that doesn't stop our engagement, and that doesn't stop our community outreach.
Thank you, Chief Scott. Commander Hamilton, I see you opened your microphone. Did you want to add something, sir?
I did, and I'm also going to be joined by my HT OVB Vice Supervisor, Lieutenant Mark Evans. So can you hear me clearly? So I make sure. Okay, good. So I'm going to echo some of the same things as Deputy Chief Scott and the Sergeant echoed. And I first want to say, Tika and Ori gave an outstanding presentation there, and she, after 5.5 years in Vice, I actually worked Vice here in Van Nuys back in the early 90s when it was completely out of control, quite frankly. Shortly thereafter was a Vice supervisor in Hollywood Division, where it was also completely out of control. The work that's been done by this department, working with the community over the last couple of decades to relieve the city of the scourge of street walking prostitution has been phenomenal. Back then, people were saying this was going to be an artifact of Los Angeles that we would never get rid of. And this department, working with the community, has made great strides in that area. And I will tell you right up front that if this funding goes away and we cannot maintain our foot on the gas, we are going to see these problems come back to communities that we have worked very hard over the last few years to eradicate. Going in specifically to the Operations Valley Bureau experience, I want to, specifically talk about first the funding. Our funding has been cut to zero. So just to be very specific, without those funds to run the overtime details, to have the staffing, to have the rental cars that we need to operate as undercover officers, that is a huge tool that is being used basically really just to maintain where we are right now. The problem with the decreased funding is you're going to start seeing slippage, and you're going to start seeing victims like Ori, like Tika, come back out to the community being repeatedly victimized because our officers are not there to intervene. And that's a huge price to pay. We often look at things as a blight on the community, but quite often, as you just saw powerfully, the human impact of what happens out on the streets with these young lives that are forever lost sometimes. They are success stories because they worked with the police and with service providers, and they were able to get out of what we call the life. They were able to get out of the game. That's great, but we have hundreds of other victims that come through the city of Los Angeles that are trafficked by these pimps that are not going to have the same opportunity as them. That's who we're actually working for. We're working to save their futures. And these are real lives that we're talking about saving over these years. There are real lives behind these numbers, behind the community complaints. By taking that funding away, we are forfeiting these lives, and we're leaving them in this life of oppression and victimization. And make no mistake, Alan was absolutely right. It's the life of victimization for these young women and some of these young men as well. We faced a 50% reduction in our staffing because that funding was cut. And just briefly for the commissioners, the reason the funding for the rental cars is so important is just like we have training and we have work to hone our skills, the human traffickers, the pimps and panderers, they do the exact same thing. They're out there watching us all the time. So we have to do counter surveillance. We have to change up what we do. A big part of that is using different cars so that we're not easily identifiable when we're dealing with the same pimps that come to the same areas. Previously, back at the start of this effort in Human Trafficking and Operations Valley Bureau, we used to be funded to the tune of $1 million. And that was back a few years ago. That funding is now zero. That funding that used to be at $1 million level is now zero. Plus, we used to get $25,000 to $30,000 a year for the rental cars as well. So those things severely impact our ability to keep corridors like the Sepulveda Boulevard corridor clear of street walking prostitution. There's another cost though that I want to make sure that the commissioners understand. We have a cost of allowing other types of Part 1 criminal activity and Part 2 criminal activity to come in when human traffickers come in, when the prostitution activity increases. We have an increase in aggravated assaults. We have an increase in other Part 1 crimes. We see robberies, we recover guns. These are all artifacts of allowing street walking prostitution activity to continue in a corridor. Some of the crime increases we've seen July 2020 to December 2020 along the Sepulveda corridor: aggravated assaults up 3.64%, burglary up 11.76%, motor vehicle theft up 4.26%, burglary theft from vehicle up 5.88%. Now these numbers start small, but I can guarantee you, based on my 31 years of experience, as you start seeing traffickers come back into an area and the blight, and then the Johns come back into the area, you will see them being victimized. You will see the girls being victimized. You will see all of that being reported. And we will again see crime increases occurring along these corridors that we have used these funds very judiciously over the last few years to virtually eliminate the blatant street walking prostitution out here in the San Fernando Valley. That was identified, by the way, 5 years ago as one of the main citizen complaints in Operations Valley Bureau. That is why this funding was directed towards this effort, along with getting the victims off the street. Because of the reduced funding, just a couple of quick numbers. Operations Valley Bureau, pimping and pandering arrests have gone from 58 to 27, we're down 53%. Prostitution arrests have gone from 371 to 235, we're down 36%. Loitering arrests down 23%, they've gone from 109 to 83. And total arrests are down 35%, 566 to 366. So, in prior years, we looked at running somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 120 overtime details, depending on funding. And these were targeted, planned details where we could apply the monies and the personnel resources towards the areas where we were seeing the most problem, the most community complaints. Another thing I want to talk about that's not often thought about in terms of our enforcement, our community engagement. So in 2019, we had 447 community engagement incidents with our Human Trafficking Task Force. 2020, those numbers are down to 192. Because of the reduction in resources, we're not able to get out to the community as much. Now, I want to remind the commissioners, when we get out to the community, we are allowed to, talk about lighting, talk about security efforts, talk about hardening the target. We're able to get out to the community and ask them to work with us in conjunction with the police department to make the atmosphere less inviting, crime prevention through environmental design. We do these things to make it harder for the traffickers to come back and put the girls out to work and make it a less, inviting environment to prevent them from coming out here in the first place. That is our goal. However, as you see these things deteriorate and the connectivity is reduced, it's kind of like one of the things which Ori brought up was a very, very good point. It takes repeated touches to develop those relationships with the trafficking victims. It also takes repeated touches to establish and maintain those connections with the community. And that is an absolutely crucial part of the success out here in Operations Valley Bureau that I don't want the commission to lose sight of. We have, we've seen out here in Operations Valley Bureau, 40% of our rescues in Operations Valley Bureau, minors. There were minors that we've rescued off the street. Now, our rescue numbers are down, and there's a little bit of a different tack that we take in Operations Valley Bureau. We generally use our undercover officers that are youthful in appearance to target our pimps and panderers and our traffickers so that we can get a better filing rate. We have a 95% filing rate out here, and we're very successful in we've been very successful in our prosecutions. By having a good victim, i.e. an undercover officer, we are often not struck by some of the victim problems that we have by having a rescued individual testify in court against a trafficker. We're having much greater success having our undercover officers testify against these traffickers in court. So I wanted to be brief. I don't want to go too long, but I do want to say this about Operations Valley Bureau. We've had great success out here working with the community and working with our local government officials to this point. But if we take our foot off the gas, everyone needs to realize this problem can very easily return. Again, I have 5.5 years in vice enforcement on the Los Angeles Police Department. I've literally participated in upwards of 1,000 vice investigations. I worked very closely with the late Tom LaBonge, who was a good friend of mine, to author legislation for seizing nuisance vehicles back when I worked Hollywood Vice in the late 90s. And I've been in this game for a long time. I will tell you this without fail. If the funding for these efforts is discontinued citywide, we're going to see not only the atmosphere of increased victimization, we're going to see this activity return because the pimps have a social media network where they communicate all the time. If there is a perception that Los Angeles is open for business, they will utilize this track to make their money. They're going to go where they can make the money. And we cannot allow that to return and to worsen here in Los Angeles. I remain available for any of your questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Commander Hamilton. Again, thank you, and to Chief Scott and your team, Sergeant, for your presentations. Much appreciated in providing perspective on what you're facing both in South Bureau and in Valley Bureau. Commissioner Kalanche, I promised you the first question, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions that are more related to, I guess, kind of the structure of the task force and funding. How long do officers serve as part of the task force? Like, what is a period of time that they might be part of a task force? I'm assuming that the longer that they stay, the more expert, they become more experts in the work. So I'm curious about that, how long the officers stay.
And for South Bureau, because it's not a vice tour, they will stay as long as they want until they get promoted or move out, but we don't have a rotation for them.
Okay.
For Operations Valley Bureau, it's the same, but we also rotate our vice operators in the Valley for training throughout the operations.
So there's a consistency there. The other question is, sorry, my dogs. And I think you kind of touched on it, the prosecution rate. I'm wondering about the prosecution rate, and you kind of touched on that. I know you talked about the filing of 95%. What is your prosecution rate, or average, I guess, prosecution rate?
Yeah, filing rate over 95.
I'll take that one, Chief. So out here in the Valley, we're very successful because we have the victims are undercover officers.
Mm-hmm.
So we remain in the 90s there. It fluctuates a little bit, but we're very successful in both the filing rate and the success in prosecution.
That's great. And then lastly, I'm wondering if the department receives any grant funding for the work. I know that we apply for other like federal funds and state funds for other projects, but I'm wondering if there's any grant funding that comes into the department for this work.
Commissioner, I'll answer that. No, currently actually the 2 sergeants and the 14 personnel that are currently assigned are actually harvested from patrol units. Each of the area vice units have a small contingent of officers in the 18 areas. They're generally about 4 officers and a supervisor. The Human Trafficking Task Force was established in South Bureau and in Valley Bureau because of what's been referred to as a track. That are these historic areas that for shamefully 50 years have served general underlying environmental conditions. You'll see that this is like Route 66, the old motels, the kind of a lean-to locations, the single occupancies served as a hotbed. And the department's been working diligently over many years to cut down, but historically was focusing on prostitution. What's happened in the last 10 years is recognizing that this pattern of child exploitation, that taking children as well as young, generally women, and exploiting them through trafficking has changed the dynamics from looking at this as a prostitution problem, to looking at it as a much richer problem, which is how it's a fueling and a funding source for gangs. And it devastates these lives generally of women, but there are young men and young men and men as well that are trafficked, as generally the feeding path of this is the foster care system and the runaways. But all this is said that in shifting this from a vice unit focus to a human trafficking focus has been the energies of the organization that has not been funded beyond the fact that we've reallocated resources now with the support of the last 4 to 5 years of Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez, and with support and growing support from Councilmember Marquise Harris Dawson on the Figueroa corridor, is some investment by the council to augment these, because as South Bureau saw the establishment of the Human Trafficking Task Force, as did Valley Bureau, these officers work 4 days a week. And so even though these 16 people represent a sizable investment of department monies in the millions of dollars, these added fuels, by adding what was initially about a $500,000 to $1 million and grew to be a 1.5 million last year, really allowed us to force multiply the number of shifts on those locations, as well as to expand the influence of other officers because we brought them in on these details. Unfortunately, with the elimination of overtime within the organization, these earmarks, this was one of them, Vision Zero was others, has eliminated our ability to do the overtime. However, we've remained committed to this point to maintain these 2 task forces, despite the fact that the organization had to reorganize with the loss of 350 sworn personnel. Now, I will say both of these details are in jeopardy if further cuts are required, simply from a matter of continued staffing. If we were to lose an additional 355 officers, these cuts have to come from positions. And as we said yesterday in my remarks, we have moved away from specialized areas to give geographic areas as much of the remaining staffing as possible. So I've given you a little broad discussion, but I do want to call out, because we've not talked about the council support, but Councilmember Monica Rodriguez, Chair of Public Safety, and Marquise Harris Dawson, and also some support from the Council President, Nuri Martinez, have been vocal supporters and have brought funding to this. What the command staff is telling you here today, though, is those augmented deployments are jeopardized with the lack of the continued funding of overtime. And yet we also recognize, as I said yesterday, and we say every day, we recognize that the city is in a very precarious position when it comes to funding.
Got it. That was very helpful. I would encourage us to look at federal funding or other funding that might be available to even further augment the work. I mean, it seems like this work is like super important and could use even more resources. So I really, if we are kind of the epicenter of a lot of the trafficking, I think that we would be in a good position to get more federal funding or other funding, even foundation funding, to address some of these issues that impact youth. So I would love to work with you on looking to identify other funding sources to further augment the budget to have the resources that we need to address these issues.
Thank you, Commissioner. Much appreciated. Commissioners, questions for the department on this issue? I recognize we've been working at this for a bit. You might have had your questions answered, but if you do have questions, please, Commissioner Bonner, I see your mic is open, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just needed a little bit of clarification on a couple of points, because that are a little bit muddled, probably in my mind. But I noted a couple of things. One is the briefing, referred to commenting on the impact on the task forces. And I think there's a reference to the enforcement generally, or the human trafficking operations generally. And then the commander was speaking to all the efforts of cleaning up and getting streetwalkers off the street, and that in my mind is a little bit muddled with the question of trafficking versus addressing this as a prostitution issue. And then I saw the breakout in the charts were referencing the arrest versus the rescues. So I'm not clear, were some of the rescues people who had been arrested, do some of the arrests refer, or are they different? Are you addressing different things? So I need a little bit of clarification really on that generally. And then finally, in terms of the budget impact, the impression or the perception is that I know you have these 2 specialized areas that have been identified as particularly problematic, and that's where I understand the task force is concentrating their efforts on. But the picture that's painted is as if if the funding goes away, the operations goes away, or the effort goes away. And I don't believe that's the case, but I'm trying to understand, without the task force, that can't be the only source of police engagement, on this issue. I know there's a training bulletin or something on trauma-informed policing that really speaks more to how officers can identify, when they're investigating a crime, they can identify people who appear to have signs of trauma that may be caught up in a trafficking situation or domestic violence. But I just need some clarification of, let's talk about, worst case scenario, the task force goes away in some way or is not funded. I need to understand what is the compensation, or how you compensate for that relative to patrol officers generally, and how capable they are of dealing with this. But then I'm coming back to Alan's point. Are the patrol officers going to be thinking of it as they're being asked to redouble efforts to get streetwalkers off the street, or are they going to also have the capacity to draw the distinction the chief just underscored between moving from a vice mentality to a human trafficking posture? I know it's a fair amount there, but just clean it up as best you can. I appreciate it.
Chief, you mind if I take that? Okay. Commissioner, just to kind of sharpen it a little bit more, and I apologize. So the numbers are the overall numbers, and some of the numbers are going to be arrests for when I say overall numbers, meaning Johns, prostitution related, could be anything from loitering to arresting a John for picking up an undercover officer or attempting to pick up an undercover officer. And then you have your pimping category. So those are mixed in with the total arrests. In terms of specifically the effect of diminishing the funding. So I'm going to break this down into kind of two tiers. You have your basic human trafficking task force, which covers, as the chief said, those 4 days. So you have 4 of the 7 days covered. The additional funding allows for persistence. Now, persistence in the trafficking world, in trafficking and pimping is kind of interchangeable, just for clarification. In the trafficking world, persistence is what really deters the activity from coming back to the community. So we've used a deterrence model in Operations Valley Bureau, much more so than a reliance on, hitting the right spot every single time and getting your target every single time. A lot of it is persistence, visibility. As a matter of fact, Operations Valley Bureau, their Human Trafficking Task Force conducted a formal study in partnership with CSUN to change the actual environment and to analyze the environment along these tracks. So it goes beyond just monies towards enforcement. We changed the environment to make it less hospitable for them to come back out and conduct that illegal activity in the community. In terms of having other people do the enforcement, yes, there are vice units, and as the chief identified, typically they have 4 officers. Some of them are augmented with a couple of extra officers, but the vice unit has other responsibilities. One of the big impacts we're having here in the San Fernando Valley are the illegal gambling establishments. Illegal gambling establishment investigations are very complex, just like the pimping and pandering and trafficking investigations. When we make an arrest, they're very similar to a complex investigation, very similar to a homicide, especially when you have a victim involved. You have victim management, you have the prosecution issues, you have evidence management. There are a lot of factors that go into a successful prosecution, and those also take time and resources away, and that removes those resources from the street. So in other words, when they're committed to the prosecution, attending court hearings, getting victims moved around and all those other things, that's more time for the Human Trafficking Task Force off the street, and it lowers their visibility and it lowers their capability of enforcement.
So, and that's very helpful. I would say that that one thing or one recommendation I would make relative to going forward, not just with the council, but generally, is to do all that's possible to draw this distinction between the perpetrators of trafficking and the effort directed in that area versus, again, someone who may be engaged in some transaction on the street that's illegal, but is the victim of trafficking and is, you know, being thought of and treated differently. And I say this because it was interesting in doing some of my other research that even in the public health community, oftentimes you find this kind of tension where this discussion is about, you know, how important are police? Are you at the margins really? Are you at the center? Or what is the role of police? And this is one area, for example, where when you're talking about going to the source of traffickers and dealing with, you know, with the perpetrators, there's a pretty clear consensus that, yeah, law enforcement and police are seriously needed to deal with that, you know, element of it, to kind of shut off, you know, that part of it. And then it's a little less clear, you know, what the thinking is as to how do you deal with, you know, the victims, you know, the women involved. But that's at least, I think, just something that we'll continue to struggle with. But to be clear, in these conversations, you know, in terms of arrest and enforcement and things, how much of that is dealing on which side of the equation? So,
a Commissioner, having come up through the ranks with Dr. Powell, you know, through all these years, I've literally known Stephanie for, gosh, going on 25 years. We came up through the ranks together. We both worked Vice at the same time. We kind of fought the same battles, and the linkage there between our victims and law enforcement, as Ori said, is crucial to not only the recovery of the victim, but it's crucial to the prosecution of the trafficker. That is a symbiotic relationship that requires the input of a dedicated investigator on the police side. You will not have those successes if you remove any of those three legs of that stool. The NGOs that participate and are very well equipped cannot go in and prosecute, and they cannot go in and do enforcement. And that is a crucial part of it. And yes, there is that push-pull in terms of them being identified as criminal perpetrators on the prostitution side, i.e. committing an act of prostitution. But they are critical in terms of their victimization, especially the minors, and they are critical in making sure that the traffickers are brought to justice.
Thank you, Commander Hamilton.
Law enforcement plays that role.
Thank you, Commander. Commissioner Bonner, anything further, sir?
Just one, and this somebody can get with me later on this offline, which is this conversation today has been all about the situation involving women or young girls and women who may be encountered on the streets. But I know there's a big domestic violence element of this problem as well, and so I'll maybe follow up with either one, the commander or Chief Scott, offline. Somebody who can talk to me a little bit about the efforts relative to addressing this in the context of domestic violence.
Absolutely, Commissioner Bonner. Thank you. I'll ask the department to follow up with the commissioner, and it might be potentially even Detective Bureau, but I'll leave to the department to decide that. Commissioner Soboroff, Commissioner Briggs, I see your mic is open, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Commander Hamilton, and thank you, Chief Scott. I really appreciate your presentations. This question is directed to either Commander Hamilton or Chief Moore. If you had a wish list in terms of recommending to the City Council the amount that should be funded for these task force to deal with human trafficking, what would it be?
If I could, no, I'll take that, Alan. Thank you.
I'm going to defer. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was put aside, the last 1.5 million, provided a disbursement amongst the 4 geographic bureaus. South Bureau and Valley Bureau are the only ones that we've harvested additional resources to center on the day-to-day focus. And then we expanded that persistence by adding overtime. Central Bureau and West Bureau, by the way, are not immune from this issue. Trafficking occurs, sex trafficking occurs across this entire city. And so it's the degree in which we have seen it that's caused a focus in these 2 areas. But restoring this would be important. But I also have to, this is a matter of, I want to remind everyone that and assure you that we're going to continue our investigative efforts as they are here. And we're going to focus on the pimping side to prosecute those that are purveyors of this evilness and really hold them accountable, as well as the Johns, the people that are creating the demand for this sinister act of cruelty from one human being to another. and the community has to have a presence and not allowing this marketplace to take place by allowing or facilitating the conduct of generally men who come and prey upon these generally women. So this is an ongoing initiative that we're continuing to go after. This funding that we're identifying here today is one area that we've had to cut and reduce that has impacts. Our effort as a department will be to minimize the enormity of those impacts by utilizing and rearranging our existing resources. What hasn't been mentioned here today, and I want to call out Deputy Chief Chris Pitcher and his command of Detective Support and Vice Division, is the Human Trafficking Task Force that is there. They truly then, goes back about 7 years, established the first task force in this area that grew. And that had to be curtailed as well. So, but our commitment as a department is some of these specialized areas have required us to realign back to geographic areas, and we'll continue to focus on that. If we had that silver bullet, it would be to restore this money, but that can't be done in isolation of all the other demands on police service.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Commissioner Briggs. Commissioner Soboroff, questions or no? You had them all answered. Okay, very good. So the matter before us is to review the department's report, transmit to the Public Safety Committee. And I would like to modify that to include the transcript of the Board of Police Commissioners' presentations on item 3A and 3B today, to add that to the report. And Mr. Tiefenk advises that's not a problem, correct, sir? Very good. And with respect to the earlier conversation from Commissioner Briggs, as also recommending in a separate letter from the commission, I take it, Commissioner Briggs, to recommend to the City Council that they fully fund the Human Trafficking Task Forces without cutting other portions of the department, Commissioner Briggs, is that correct?
Correct.
And just to ask the city to prioritize this because of the vulnerability of the victims and that they are in fact the most vulnerable in our community that need protection. Do I largely have that correct, Commissioner Briggs?
You do. Thank you. Thank you for giving voice to my thoughts.
I don't always get it right, as other commissioners will tell you. But with that, I will move that forward. And is there a second?
Second.
Commissioners, if you could open your microphones, and all in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Very good. It passes 5-0. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you for your time on this incredibly important issue. As we all know and have heard, this is a pervasive and insidious crime that threatens our young people throughout the city, the most vulnerable. And I appreciate your patience in hearing all these details. And my thanks again to all the presenters today, both from the department as well as from the community groups, and most especially all the survivors. Thank you.